Welcome back to the Pursuit Podcast. I'm your host, Jessica Rose. And for December, we're going to be looking at different aspects of open source, having a new guest join us every Tuesday. This week, we're going to look at getting into open source for the first time, and we're going to be speaking to someone who's worked with the 24 pull request project. I'm here today with
Nadia Odunayo.
Nadia, what do you do?
I'm a software developer. I run a small company. It's just me and one other person. And we're currently working with enterprise teams to help them run their cloud platforms.
Oh, how wonderfully exciting. And if I recall correctly, if I've been informed correctly, you were recently working with a project that involves getting people giving back to open source every day?
Yes. So I helped run the 24 pull requests program in 2016. So 24 pull requests is a challenge, I guess, where in the run up to Christmas, so the 1st of December to the 24th of December, people taking part in the challenge are encouraged to commit at least one pull request to open source every day.
Oh, like an advent calendar where you give instead of where you get.
Yeah, exactly that. It was inspired by the 24 Ways advent calendar of blogging. I don't know if you've heard of that.
No, I haven't, but I'll try and make sure to check that out. It might be something that's really interesting for our listeners as well.
Yes, exactly. And so, because I think 24 Ways gives you advice on programming and things like that. I've not checked it out myself, but the 24 pull requests was a way to say, how can we do an advent calendar of pull requests?
How wonderfully cool. Do you find that people who are just getting into open source or just sort of trying to double down and really get into it find this program useful?
100%. I think I'm an example of that myself. I hadn't done much open source before Andrew Nesbitt, who was the creator of 24 pull requests, reached out to me last year and said, do you want to be a maintainer on this thing for this year? And I was very much like, oh, am I the right person to do this? I've not done much open source before. What does this entail? This sounds like a big responsibility. But he said, it's very low maintenance. Just make sure that for people submitting on the 24 pull requests repo as part of the challenge, you're available to now and again check out the pull requests, merge in the code. Still, I was thinking, wow, this is a big responsibility. But I thought, let me go for it. I've always been curious about open source. When I used to work at Pivotal as an engineer, I did do some open source work as part of their Cloud Foundry platform, but that was in the safety net of working at a company. And so I hadn't done much as an individual. And I thought, this is a great opportunity to see what it's all about. And so it is a wonderful way for people who are inexperienced with open source to get into it, particularly because a lot of people get their projects ready for 24 pull requests. So they do things to make it easy for people who have not committed to open source before but are taking part in the challenge to get those pull requests in.
So you're saying that you found as a maintainer on 24 pull requests that projects were actively looking to sort of lower the barrier to entry for new open source developers. They were trying to make it as easy as possible for people to come in?
Definitely. And this is not all projects, but there are a few that set themselves up to make it easy specifically for new developers, whether it's having something like a really detailed contribution guide and labeling issues with beginner friendly so that they're easy to spot, or even seeding the project with a few issues that are beginner friendly, even though perhaps the maintainers or people already contributing to the project could easily deliver that feature, within a few minutes.
That's really interesting. So making sure that you leave those issues that might be great for beginner learning sounds like a really wonderful way for projects to move forward.
I think that's what people are doing. I know that I've definitely got that idea to do that on my open source project myself for when 24 pull requests comes around this year. So there are a few simple features that I want to do on my project, but I'm thinking, well, 24 pull requests is coming up. They're really easy Rails issues, like ordering things in a certain way or hiding certain elements in a collection based on a certain attribute. And so I'm thinking, well, rather than me just spending half an hour doing that, maybe I should leave these things such that when new people come and look at my project and they want to take part in 24 pull requests, they can find these issues and think, oh, that's not so scary. I can do that quickly. I know what I'm doing there.
And if our dear listener right now is someone who's new to open source and they're absolutely convinced they want to get involved, just as like a cheeky plug, what is your open source project?
So my open source project is called Speakerline, and it's a site to showcase conference speakers' proposals in order to demystify the call for proposal process. I got into conference speaking a couple of years ago, and I wouldn't have gotten into it if I didn't have people around me who'd been on the conference scene, knew what they were like, what a good proposal looked like, and helped me to craft one such that my first talk was at RailsConf.
Oh,
so
wow.
That was a really big stage. And from then on, I was invited to be on the committee for different Ruby Central conferences. I got my proposal accepted at other conferences. And all of a sudden, I was speaking on big stages. And as I would go to these conferences, I would meet people who hadn't spoken before and clearly wanted to get into speaking, but thought, oh, how do I get started? Definitely not going to get started at a big conference. How did you get started, Nadia? And I'd always say, actually, I did start at RailsConf. And that often took people by surprise. And the real moment when I said, I've got to build this thing is when I was taking part in one of the RubyConf conferences. I think it was in 2016. And I was part of their Scholar Guide program. So that's where you have a more experienced either developer or conference goer buddying up with someone who's never been to a conference before, but they're probably a junior developer. And you help them find their way around the conference, go to talks that will help them get the most out of it, and things like that. And in the run-up to this conference, we had a Slack channel. And because what tends to happen is the guides end up being speakers as well.
Okay. That makes quite a bit of sense.
Yeah, because they're the kind of people who are keen to get involved and they're going anyway. So they're like, yeah, why not have a buddy to mentor for the conference? And so in the Slack channel, one of the scholars said, oh, do any of the speakers mind sharing their proposal that got accepted? And what happened was very interesting. So not only did many speakers share a proposal that got accepted, so the talk that they were going to give at the conference, a lot of people started sharing proposals that they had also submitted, but that didn't get accepted.
Oh.
And everyone was getting really excited. And I thought, wait a minute, there are speakers who really are keen to give up this information. And there are also lots of people who want this information, mainly people who are curious about, oh, what's this world of writing a conference proposal? And so let me make a platform where people can start sharing this and anyone can see it, not just people who are part of this Scholar Guide program for RubyConf. And so that was the beginning of the project for me. And it's at speakerline.io, so speaker and then line.io. And the repo is at my GitHub, so NODUNAYO/speakerline. So come and contribute. And you'll find out more about the story in the README.
So we've talked a little about 24 pull requests and its sort of fitness as a tool for somebody getting into open source for the first time. And we've talked about your open source project, which also helps new speakers get off on their feet. I was wondering if we could refocus and come back around to sort of your advice and your views on what the best pathway might be for someone coming in and looking to get into open source, much in the way that you have. So I think the first question I'd have around that is, what do you think the hardest thing about getting started in open source is?
I think it depends per person, but I know that a lot of people do talk about the fear of making that first pull request. So I think the hardest thing might be getting over that fear of contributing. And I think it's particularly when it's not just a documentation change. So people often say, a good first thing is to change the docs. However, I think even once you've done that, it's like, okay, now I want to do some code. And it can be really difficult to think, wow, my code, which probably not many other people have seen, or I've often been in the safety of my work environment, I'm going to now put this code out there and people might judge this code and say it's not good enough or reject it.
So the fear of rejection sounds like something that can be a real blocker for new folks getting into open source.
I definitely think so, because you can come into an open source repository and you can see that, oh, there's a community that already exists here. There are already a few people who are regular contributors. There seems to be a way things are done. And you might come along and say, oh, I really want to commit to this, but I don't know if it's going to be good enough or it's going to be what the people already expect, which is funny because the whole thing about open source is it should be open to new ideas. And I think something that can make this easier is if in READMEs, maintainers and people contributing to a project gave more guidelines on, how you might approach a feature in a repo and what are the kind of philosophies and practices that people who regularly contribute to the repo use in order to move the project along. Because that can give new people an anchor to say, oh, okay, this is the kind of style people use and this is why. And I think it also would make it easier for a new person who had a different way of doing things to explain why they thought a different way might be more interesting. Because often in READMEs, you see how you get set up and how you run the tests, but there's not much guidance on, okay, how do we typically do things here? What are our expectations? And I think you've got to be careful because you don't want to say, this is how we do things. And if you don't do things this way, goodbye. But it's more in the style of, hey, you might not be sure how to help us do this. Here are some things that we like to keep in mind when we're developing features on this project. And so, yeah, I definitely think the hardest thing is this fear of rejection and thinking, am I going to spend all this effort and my work won't be accepted? What should I do? Who do I speak to?
And this touches on a point you made early in our conversation where you talked about how you saw open source projects making themselves more beginner friendly to prepare for 24 pull requests.
Yes. And I think I might be projecting a bit because a lot of the things I said are things that I'm planning on doing to get a speaker line ready for this year's challenge. But
if it's reassuring at all, I've also heard other open source project maintainers talk about working to get their projects more beginner friendly. Not necessarily for 24 pull requests, but just sort of in general. It's something that I think a lot of really good maintainers are thinking about right now.
Yes. And in fact, Andrew recently started a thread on GitHub in order for people to nominate projects to be featured on the website. So each year there are a set of, I think, 8 or so projects that are featured on the homepage. So when you go onto the website and you're really not sure where to begin, you can say, oh, these are 8 projects. So these are 8 ideas that I can get stuck into. And so on this thread, people have been nominating the projects that they think should go in those slots. And a lot of the reasons for why a project should be chosen stem around, which projects have maintainers that are keen to help beginners get stuck in, which projects have the setup to make it easy for new people to commit. And so, I'm reading things like, this project has a team of people ready to help newbies commit code. And, they've got well-labeled issues and things like that. So there's a lot of focus. There's more and more focus on how do we help a wider pool of people, particularly beginners, get stuck in. And so it's really cool to see the theme and trend moving in that direction, as opposed to, we need an expert in this to come and help us take this project to the next stage.
So really recognizing that building your project and building a community around it needs to happen at all levels.
Yes. And I think when you say the word community, I think another hard thing about getting started in OS is that it's remote. So there's one which is, what am I doing? But then the next thing is it's who do you talk to? It's the maintainer. They could just be a name on GitHub, and it's not really easy to necessarily reach out to them. And even with other people who are regularly contributing to the code, sometimes initially, until you get stuck in, it can seem quite impersonal because it's just you on your computer looking at the README, looking at a list of issues and thinking, shall I take that on? Because it's almost a statement to say, yes, I'm going to be the one to work on this and do this. And you might try and, assign yourself to an issue or say, I'll take this on. And it's almost like until you start getting stuck in and you start interacting with people, maybe through submitting the first pull request, it's not like you're in an office and you can go and say, hi, I'm here, I'm thinking of committing. It can be like a black hole. And I think that's also very difficult. And it doesn't help getting over that fear of rejection.
Well, you've just kind of got to wander in for your first time, it sounds like.
Yeah, exactly. You just got to take a plunge. And you don't know, I think, until you've submitted that first pull request and seen how it's been received or how it goes through the pipeline, whether it gets accepted or rejected or not. You don't know what kind of community or world you're stepping into. I guess you can get a sense of it by looking at how many issues are currently open, what the discussion is like on those issues, looking at closed pull requests, seeing what the conversation was like around those issues. But for example, if it just so happens that not many beginners have submitted code before and it's been the regular maintainers and it's just a case of pull request submitted, pull request merged, you still can't get a vibe for what it will be like if you're a beginner going in and submitting for the first time, particularly because the people who maintain the project might not be used to working with code that, for example, is done in a different style, or maybe needs a bit of help, is almost there, but might need a little bit of feedback. So it's all very uncertain ground, I think.
So you've offered some really good advice throughout our conversation about what beginners and what people in general, I think, should do before making that first pull request on a new open source project. So you talked about going in and reading the READMEs just in case they left valuable information in there, taking a look at what kind of issues get accepted, what the code style looks like. Is there any other advice you would have? So if I'm coming up to a new open source project, maybe I'm a little bit new myself, what else should I do before getting involved?
So I think one thing that you could do is maybe even reach out to the maintainer perhaps. So you can reach out to them and say, hey, I'm new, I'm looking to contribute, this is where I'm at. Do you have any suggestions for which issues I can pick up? Because I think that does a few things. So that makes it less impersonal because the maintainer will get back to you and you'll have a bit of a conversation. And I think you'll get a sense of, what the project's like just through a conversation with the maintainer. If you can manage to have one. I mean, maintainers are really busy, but part of being a maintainer is fostering a great community. So you'd like to think that any maintainer can find time to respond to requests such as this. And then you also know that when you start working on whatever the issue is, you've already had almost the encouragement or the blessing from the maintainer that, yeah, this is a great thing that you can do and this is something that will be valuable. So I think that will help with the whole fear of rejection because you know that you're working on something that has a high chance of being accepted and you already know it's valuable. And I think you've also opened a channel of if you get stuck or if you're not sure about something, you've now started a conversation with someone. And so it's easy to go from there. And maybe you're reaching out via GitHub to the maintainer directly, or perhaps you're starting an issue introducing yourself and then saying, hey, I'm here, what can I work on? And then depending on how people respond and how long it takes people to respond, you'll get a good sense of what the community's like. And hopefully that will just put you at ease a little bit.
That's fantastic advice to just say hello and say, I'd like to do this. Mm-hmm. It sounds like a lot of the sort of difficult jump into getting into open source is getting into a new project and it being such a sort of mysterious space. So you've talked a lot about the value of 24 pull requests, the value of getting into that first open source project, and how open source maintainers can make their projects more friendly for beginners. What about why I might want to, or why our dear listener might want to get into open source in the first place? What's the benefit of it?
I think if you're a developer, if you've got the time and the luxury to get into open source, then it's an amazing way to advance not only your technical skills, but also your people skills. Because it comes with a different set of challenges, I think, particularly if you don't already work remotely and you're working in an office. So in terms of development skills, I mean, I think that's pretty straightforward. You get to practice more on either a technology you're already familiar with or one you've never touched before. So inevitably, you're going to get better at it. And then I think the more interesting side is the people skills and the communication skills. And this comes on many levels. So there's the communication of, one, like I said, are you even just introducing yourself to the repo and asking questions around, how do I get stuck in? But I think what's more interesting is both as a maintainer and a contributor, talking about code and giving feedback on why you do or you don't want to accept some code. Because I think it can be a very sensitive issue, particularly if you're not quite convinced or you don't want the code to go into the repository, you have to explain why. Is it that something's missing? Are you worried about it breaking something? And you have to do it in a way that's not just attacking or dismissive to the other person, but in a way that's helpful and productive. And this comes back around to a lot of things I've been talking about to do with nonviolent communication. So how do you give honest feedback whilst being kind? So for me anyway, being involved in open source has really helped me practice that, because there have been scenarios where, for example, as a maintainer on SpeakerLine, someone who's just ramping up has submitted code and I don't want to merge it in because I can see it's going to cause some real issues. And I have to take time to explain why I'm not going to merge in the code without attacking the person and without making them think, oh, I'm not going to submit again. And I think I've done a good job, because with some people that this has happened with, that they've continued to commit and stay involved. But there's another side of it where if there are things like microaggressions or misunderstandings and miscommunications, and it's all remote, you can't just jump on the phone to these people and they're not in the office, you can't go over to their desk. It's like, how do you diffuse those situations? And, I was in a case where there was a misunderstanding about something I'd said. I think someone just didn't read what I'd said properly, and the response was patronizing and implied that I didn't understand. And so it was a practice of, I took a few deep breaths and I was like, I'm going to assume benign intent. There's no reason why this person spoke to me like this beyond them, they're going through a difficult thing or they're just not paying attention. And so I gave a very, measured response back, didn't make a personal attack or accuse the person of being patronizing or anything else. And the response back was, very apologetic. It was like, I'm very sorry, I just didn't read what you'd said properly. And so that situation was diffused. And so it's a really good way to practice communication skills in a way where there's further challenges because of the remoteness and because of the sensitive topic of your code and whether someone likes it or not, for example.
So this is really interesting. It's not just valuable for someone getting into open source as a contributor, the value behind getting feedback on your code, the value behind doing some of the work and getting the visibility, but you've also touched quite a bit on the value of being an active community member and even a maintainer within open source, and the value that goes beyond just technical, the value of sort of learning to manage people, learning to communicate clearly, and learning to sort of get through things without conflict.
Yeah, there's definitely those benefits and challenges on both sides. I think there's a lot of responsibility on maintainers to manage and foster a welcoming community. And there's also a responsibility on people coming into a project to be respectful and to communicate intention clearly, and to take the opportunity to say, yeah, this is a space where I should practice being constructive, being kind, being actionable. And I think that comes on both sides, whether you're a contributor or a maintainer.
This is fantastic. Our episode airing in 2 weeks is going to focus on what it's like to maintain a large open source project and touches on a lot of the responsibilities you've spoken on and a lot of the skills that people can develop. Thanks very much for giving us a very, very valuable preview.
Oh, wow. Thanks.
If you could go back in time and looking at yourself when you first started getting involved with open source, or the first time you considered it and maybe backed away, what kind of advice would you want to give that past version of you?
So, looking back to when I was exploring projects and thinking about why I wanted to get involved but didn't, I think that a lot of projects don't have a middle ground with regards to issues. So, you might see somewhere that you can help on the doc side. So, I can make this clearer, or I can fix that typo. And that's always suggested as the first thing. Or you might see these huge features or waffly issues in the issue section, which seem like, I don't want to touch those. Those are big and I need to understand the project more. And so I think something that I wish I'd done, and it comes back to that saying hello thing, is rather than saying there's nothing here for me to do, starting an issue or reaching out and saying, hey, this is me. There's nothing really to do on the docs, so I don't even want to do docs. I'm looking to do something a bit more. But these issues currently outstanding seem a bit large. Are there any things I can help with that aren't so big, but that will help me contribute code to the project? So I wish I'd started those conversations more instead of going away and going, oh, there's nothing here for me.
So kind of the conversations you'd want to be having in sort of a very, very culturally healthy technology team, being able to come back to the team and say, hey, these issues or these stories, these features aren't very well scoped. Can we have a conversation around separating these out a bit more, making them a bit more clear?
Yeah, that's one thing. So I think that would be amazing if people started having those conversations, particularly new people, because it's a way to, like I say, introduce yourself and get over that fear of, I don't know who these people are and whether they're going to accept what I've done. And I also think that's a way to be valuable in an open source project without committing code. So you're already valuable just by starting that sort of conversation, saying, how can we scope these things better? Because it's the kind of thing that engineers working with product managers on software teams should be doing, helping the product person to find better slices of stories that help to test the end-to-end functionality without being a huge chunk of work. However, though, there are cases where an idea is not fully formed and the maintainer is putting an issue out there to say, hey, we have this problem. Let's explore ideas about how we can do it. And I think you do need that space to explore. So it could also be, this bit of advice is also, how can you start a conversation to say, I see you're having these larger conversations with large scope and they're not ready yet for someone like me to jump in on. Can we try and find other opportunities for someone like me to jump in on? And when I say someone like me, I'm just referring to experience, so probably someone new.
A past version of yourself, or our dear listener where they might be today.
Exactly.
I think it might be valuable to warn as well, the same way that giving someone your code can feel really scary and vulnerable. I think a lot of times open source maintainers can feel very protective and defensive of their projects. So asking someone, can I have something better scoped? Can I have something more manageable? Can feel like, even if it's well intended, can feel like criticizing the way someone manages a project.
Yes. So you can definitely get maintainers who are protective of their projects. And I myself have gone through this as a beginner maintainer of, I'm not even confident in all of my code, even the code in speaker line. But when other people submit their code and I think, this is not quite right, or when they make suggestions for which direction they think the project should go in and it's different to the direction I had in mind, it can be very difficult to not just say, no, that's not what I want. That's not where this is going, because that's not in the spirit of open source. And so I take a lot of time to be patient and to think, okay, why do you not like this? Is it because you just don't like it because it wasn't what you had in mind? Or is there a fundamental reason? And so if it's the latter fundamental reason, then you can just take your time to explain that to someone. And if you do a good job, they'll understand. But if it's the former, part of open source is trying to not be so precious to your own ideas and realize it's open, so everyone shares ownership. And so I think if you're on the other side of that and you do get someone who is seemingly rejecting an idea or being dismissive. And again, this is more advice, I think, for beginners getting into open source who might not be so confident, particularly when communicating with maintainer. If you're not getting a really good idea for why something's been rejected, I think a good thing to do is just ask. So just say, hey, it doesn't look like you were keen on that. Why? Is there something you're worried about, or it wasn't what you had in mind for how the project could go? And you frame it as, I'm trying to get feedback because I'm trying to get involved here. And I think that will help the maintainer step back and think about, why did I respond like that? And you're likely to get a more helpful response. And perhaps you might even make the maintainer see something differently and change their mind. But if the conversation is still remaining maybe unhelpful or a bit hostile or restrictive, then maybe that's not an open source community that you want to get involved in. So I would give the feedback to beginners in this situation of, be persistent, try and get answers, be respectful, express that you're just trying to get feedback and understand and learn more, and see how that conversation goes. Don't be disheartened if the first response is not what you're expecting. If you're getting a few responses back that are very unhelpful and you don't have a good feeling about it, then then walk away. There are many other great open source projects out there, and something like 24 pull requests really helps to uncover what those projects are.
So fantastic advice for newbies getting into open source. Say hello. If you get pushed back, try again for feedback, harden your heart, try again. Thank you so much for a fascinating conversation.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
And thank you for listening. Next Tuesday, we have a very special guest, and we're going to be talking about how you can use open source activity to get into working in technology.